I'm Ronald Dunlap, immediate past president of the Massachusetts Medical Society. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual CARE Forum sponsored by MACRMI, the Massachusetts Alliance for Resolution Following Medical Injury. Before we proceed further, I'd like to remind you about a few housekeeping items. In the unlikely event of a fire, there is an exit along the left side of the auditorium as you face me. You may also exit out the back doors and move to the left. The restrooms are out the back door to your right. As I said, this is the second annual CARE Forum. As you know, this forum is happening because so many people wanted to crack the code on one of the most difficult problems in healthcare, which is how to fairly and promptly compensate patients who are injured during the course of their medical care, how to learn from these events, and how to prevent them from happening again. But as we all know, the tort system does not encourage that kind of resolution. Often, it undermines the effort to bring both tangible and intangible closure in a timely fashion when patients are injured. After many unsuccessful attempts over many years to address this issue through legislation and regulation, some foresighted people wanted to try something different. That something different came to be known as communication, apology, and resolution, or CARE. Today, this coalition has 8 partners from healthcare, law, government, and citizens groups. 6 hospitals are now sponsoring pilot programs to test this approach. This morning, we're going to hear from some of those participants, a progress report on where things stand today. As a special treat after lunch, you'll have a chance to see a different kind of work in progress, a documentary film on the CARE approach to medical liability with a discussion to follow. The Massachusetts Medical Society is proud to be a founding member of this coalition. We have every confidence that your efforts will foster a great culture change in our healthcare system. I want you to know that today's presentations will be recorded and posted on the MACRMI website in the near future. But I also want you to know that in order to promote an open dialogue, the question and answer period will not be posted. Let's start our presentation with a progress report from Alan Woodward, past president of the Massachusetts Medical Society and currently chair of our Committee on Professional Liability. He has tirelessly led our efforts on medical liability reform for many, many years. He's a major reason why we're all here today. He'll be joined in his presentation by Melinda Van Neel from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. She is project manager for MACRMI's implementation of the CARE program. Alan and Melinda.
Thank you all, and the room is not full, but we expect it will be in 10 or 15 minutes. And we have a lot of registrants, and actually looking through the list, it's very interesting. About a third of you are from the choir, meaning organizations and institutions that have already implemented this model. But the majority of you either just have an interest or are affiliated with organizations or institutions that are interested in implementing this. So we welcome you all. We think it's going to be an interesting dialogue today, and we hope it's a useful and informative program for you. So I'm going to start out talking very briefly about the history of the effort in Massachusetts because several of you are new to this program and to our annual forum. And then I'm going to really focus on the progress we've made over the last year since our last annual forum. And finally, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda to talk about some of the specifics of the new resources that have been developed since our last meeting. The forum objectives you've seen, but in essence, what we want to talk to you about is the benefits of a CARE program for patients, clinicians, and organizations and institutions that implement it, and also described to you some of the challenges that have been encountered in implementation and how to overcome them. So we're all here today for different reasons, but fundamentally we all recognize from whatever our vantage point that the current system does not serve patients or providers or our healthcare system well. My experience back in the 80s was to be made aware of a young emergency physician who committed suicide shortly after being involved in a malpractice suit. And then we started some physician well-being programs for emergency physicians in Massachusetts and brought up a guy from North Carolina, John Henry Pfefferling from the Center for Professional Well-Being, who was a cultural anthropologist who basically studies physicians as his tribe, and talked about the endocannibalism within our tribe. We eat our own, and we were talking a little bit about that last night and how we treat those we train. But in addition, I recognized from those sessions that we had a lot of pain in the tribe from physicians who were enduring the onerous process of going through litigation. And then as a chief of an emergency department, ultimately president of medical staff and president of a specialty society and ultimately Mass Medical, I recognized the toll that the current system was taking on providers. And then increasingly I was made aware of the toll it was taking on patients in addition. So, and we're going to hear some patient perspective, and it's something I've learned a great deal about as I've been involved in MACRMI. But to talk just briefly about our history and evolution in Massachusetts and how we got involved, as I think you know, Steve Cramen was sort of the inspiration behind this model back in the 90s at VA Lexington, Kentucky. And in 1999 published an article about the concept, and he's going to be here later today. He's stuck in traffic also. And then Rick Boothman in 2001 said, this is a really interesting idea. And he's here in the audience today, and I think most of you know him. And he implemented it at the University of Michigan. And it was really the first broad and comprehensive implementation. And he collected data, which is what allowed us to say this is a viable alternative when we started looking at what direction we should go. So in 2005, MMS became involved because I sat on a national roundtable convened by the Joint Commission to look at how do we move forward on patient safety and liability reform. And I was introduced to the concept at that point. Came back and chaired a task force to look at alternatives to tort reform and decided this held the greatest promise. We then invited Rick in 2007 for a symposium, ultimately did a defensive medicine study to look at the costs that were being driven in our healthcare system by the litigation or the fear of litigation, and ultimately then applied for an AHRQ grant to develop a roadmap for Massachusetts on how we could move in this direction. That was in 2010 and completed in 2011. And then in 2012, we rolled out our roadmap. So this was our planning grant. It was a one-year, $300,000 planning grant. It needed to be applied for as a healthcare institution, provider institution. So MMS approached BI, and together we applied with Ken as the principal investigator for this grant and worked with Michelle Mello, who helped us develop the methodology. And in essence, what we did was interviews of the most knowledgeable people across the state in all the key constituencies to first identify the barriers to broad implementation and the strategies to overcome each of those barriers. We then took those strategies and prioritized them and organized them to develop our roadmap, which we presented back to a large group in this room in March of 2011. And then rolled out, as I mentioned, the roadmap in 2012. But one of the things we also gleaned from these interviews was that everybody in all sectors felt the current system was suboptimal and didn't serve patients, providers, or patient safety well. And that everyone agreed that of the options they were aware of, care seemed to be the most promising. And interestingly enough, they all said, well, hello, it's the ethical and the morally the right thing to do, and it's what your grandmother taught you, so it's not rocket science. But in addition, what surprised us is virtually all of the interviewees were interested in participating in the implementation process. So I think you've all seen, this is just a list of the barriers, and if you haven't seen it, all of this information is on our website. But we started then to pick off the barriers one by one and started to deal with the necessary strategies to work on implementation. So we started even before we had set up MACRMI with enabling legislation. And again, you don't have to have any legislation for this model, and it's one of the beauties. But if you want broad and rapid adoption, it's clear that there are things you can do to facilitate it. So we worked with the Mass Bar Association and the Mass Academy of Trial Attorneys after being so advised by the House and Senate leadership that if we wanted to get anything through the legislative process, it would be much more likely if it were consensus. So we worked for 6 months, and I'll show you that legislation. We also started working on educational programs. Today's one example We recognized we needed leadership from all the constituencies functioning in our alliance, that we needed to develop best practices and have a consistent process for patients going through this model, and it needed to be high quality and reliable and open and transparent. And we needed collaborative working groups on a few key issues, some of which have been supported. And finally, since everyone says, oh, well, what works at Stanford and University of Michigan and Illinois and others can't possibly work in Massachusetts, it was very clear that we needed our own data and that we needed to disseminate it. And that's what you're going to hear about later today. So the legislation that we pursued was 4 components that we agreed to with the Mass Academy of Trial Attorneys and Mass Bar Association. So the top 4 here are the consensus language. And the specifics of this language is also on the website. But we provided for a 6-month pre-litigation resolution period. So there's time. If the case is identified through through a patient going to a lawyer, there would be time to go through this process before you end up in litigation. I should point out that the experience at the University of Michigan and others in our experience is the vast majority of cases, 85, 90%, are identified internally long before a patient ever goes to an attorney. Second provision would be that there would be sharing of all pertinent medical records. So everyone doing a root cause analysis or a liability assessment would be looking at the same set of documents. In addition, we incorporated strong apology protection, including statements related to error or omission or mistake, unless you directly contradict materially subsequently in a court, if you end up in a court, but obviously all of this is to prevent that. And finally, we thought there should be guidelines for full disclosure of significant complications. 2 other components that were in 224 related to liability were a further reduction of prejudgment interest, which since '86 till 2005 had been set at 12%, and we were successful in dropping it to T+4, which helped significantly with premiums in Massachusetts. And the other thing was the charitable immunity cap was raised from $20,000 to $100,000 for malpractice cases. That was signed in August of 2012 and became effective 90 days later, just before we started enrolling patients at our 6 pilot sites. So this is now our alliance. It includes, as you can see, Linda's group, the Medically Induced Trauma Support Services, CRICO, which is supporting the pilots at the Harvard hospitals, Coveris, which has supported us, the Mass Bar Association is on our board, MMS, Bay State, and Beth Israel as the pilots, the Mass Hospital Association, the Board of Registration of Medicine, and I will tell you, Stan Riley, who was the EVP, was an extraordinary proponent of this approach. The Mass Coalition for Prevention of Medical Errors, and 2 new ones that are just being added at the bottom there are the Atrius Health System and Sturdy Memorial Hospital. I'll comment more on them. But in essence, that's our MACRMI organization, our alliance at this point. And we renamed the program from Disclosure, Apology, and Offer to Communication, Apology, and Resolution. We felt that disclosure implied one-way communication, that we were releasing information, not a dialogue, which is essential to management of untoward events. And second of all, we thought offer just implied economic compensation, when we recognize resolution is making sure you're meeting the patient's medical needs, their psychosocial needs, as well as their financial needs. Hence, that's our name for our program. So what are the accomplishments since we last met in this room a year ago? Well, as I mentioned, we recruited 2 new pilots, Sturdy, and we were looking for different environments. At our 6 initial pilots, they are all captively insured as far as the institutions, although at their community hospitals, some of the physicians may be insured commercially. But here at Sturdy, it is a commercially insured institution and medical staff, primarily by Coveris. And Atrius is of great interest to us because it is not a hospital system. It is a multi-center, multi-specialty group. In fact, one of the subsidiaries, formerly Fallon, now Reliant, had established this model with some guidance from Rick Boothman back in 2007 with significant positive outcome, and was the only data we had from Massachusetts. Also, since last year, we've continued to collect data. We've started to roll out a provider study provider satisfaction survey with physicians going through this, and we're just applying for a grant to do surveys of patients who go through this process. We've begun using social media for communication. We have begun to implement peer support, just-in-time peer support at institutions, peer mentors. And we've developed multiple new resources, which Melinda is going to talk about, and have more in process. And one of the ones that is under development, or will be under development, is we've just recently worked with the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program to identify, and we just have a 50-page report, on the ideal form of representation for patients going through this process. We also have continued to work on clarifying reporting requirements. A year ago in July, we passed state legislation to modify the reporting requirements to the Board of Registration in Medicine. However, reporting is still one of the major impediments, and we're working with the National Practitioner Data Bank and its parent HRSA and HHS to clarify the reporting requirements of economic payments as they come out with new guidelines this July, and we're hoping there will be an FAQ specifically related to this type of program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda, who's going to talk specifically about some of the new resources that we've rolled out over the last year. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as Alan said, one of the jobs that MACRMI has is to create and distribute free resources for anyone who's looking to do a program like this in their own facility. So I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about the ones we've developed this year, but on our website there are lots of other resources, and in your folder there are a couple others as well. So the first thing we did was to develop a checklist really for potential care sites. This is a difficult program to implement, and there are some things that need to be in place before that happens. And so we thought that a lot of people were approaching us, and then what would be helpful is to have a checklist to say, these are the things that need to be in place before you start this so that you can have a successful program. That checklist is in your packet today. We also have best practices for interfacing with patients in the care process. Last year we developed some general best practices for care programs. Those are in your folder as well. But this year we realized that one of the most difficult steps in care is how do we interact with patients and help them to feel comfortable, give them what they need, and make them feel like they're being listened to. And so we all worked together as a MACRMI group to develop that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We also developed some new DPH letter templates, and this applies to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. So if you are out of state, this might not apply to you, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then an implementation guide for new pilot sites. So as Alan mentioned, Sturdy and Atrius are going to be joining us. They are in the phase of planning for implementation. So we put together a guide, which is a timeline of all the steps that need to be taken, and it actually puts all of our resources that we have in one place so that there's a guide to keep following as you go through this approach. So we'll talk about that. So our potential care pilot site checklist, as I said, these are some of the major things that are on the checklist, but that's also in your packet. But really, it's to get that institutional buy-in. So this is a checklist that shows you need to have endorsement from your medical boards at the hospital or your facility, institutional commitment to those best practices that we talked about before, demonstrated support from the CEO and board of directors, and lots of different things like that. Also just a baseline culture of safety, meaning that you have reporting systems that people feel comfortable reporting, that you do root cause analysis when you find out about an event. Those kinds of things need to be a baseline before you start a program like this. So you'll see in your packet, you can take a look at that. And then, as I said, we also developed some best practices for interfacing with patients in the care process. So these were really to answer some of the difficult questions, like how can I best communicate with patients about an adverse event over time? This is challenging, right? Because the communication process is not just one disclosure, as Alan said. That's why we changed it to communication. It's really a process, and how do you keep the lines of communication open over time? So those best practices give some guidelines about that. Also, what kind of reactions can I expect from patients? I think lots of times we think, oh, we're going to do the right thing, so the patients are going to be happy. Well, that's not necessarily true. I think that they're very well justified if something goes wrong, that they might be angry or upset for a long time, and you need to keep that line of communication open. So that really answers some of those questions there. And then, how do I prioritize patient-centered principles in my own organization? So these are all tricky things that we really felt like if we could come together and create some guidelines, it would help facilities to be able to be more successful in care programs. So what we did to create this was we all got together as a MACRMI group, put together some draft guidelines, and then we had MITS take that and show that to their patients that they work with. We had the MBA take it to some of their clients, and then we also had PFACs look at this as well, the Patient and Family Advisory Committees. So it's been through lots of different groups where patients are involved and can tell us, is this the right thing? Are we really giving the right guidance here? And so I think it's been vetted through lots of places, and I think it's going to be a really great resource. So that's also in your folder. We also developed some new DPH letter templates. So for those of you that work in risk management, I'm sure you know that when there's a serious reportable event, which is something that's defined by the Department of Public Health, that patients are required to receive 2 letters, one at 7 days to tell them that the event has occurred, and one at 30 days to tell them what the results of the investigation of that event are. The problem with these letters is that it's just a general template that was created a long time ago by a group of probably lawyers and bureaucrats, but probably not any patients were in the room. So what we did was we took these to PFAC, and we said, what would you think if you got this, and you had an adverse event, and you received this letter? And they said, I would be very upset. And this would actually make it worse for me, I think. So what we did is we worked with them to say, how can we change this from saying, we are required to tell you about this, to more of, we have a culture of safety here, we want to be transparent, and we want to improve. And so we've created some templates which are on our website, and you're welcome to use them if you want. You can obviously change them for your own organization, but we did feel like this is something that's required, and while it's not directly part of the care process, a lot of SREs end up being care events as well, and so you might as well incorporate that transparent communicative process with these letters as well. So those are available online as well. And finally, the implementation guide for the new pilot sites. So as I said, if you're an official new pilot site, you will get this implementation guide, which also is used with personal assistance from MACRMI. Obviously, a guide can't tell you everything about how to implement this and can't guide you along, but it really can help you to say, what do I need to do next? What resources are available to me so I don't have to reinvent the wheel? And it lays out that timeline of important tasks. So we have that available too. And as I said, we have this great website. It's macrmi.info. And all of those resources are available for download. You'll see up on the top there's a resource library tab. That's where all of those resources are, and they're in your folders as well.